700 years or so. So anyway, I just wanted you to speak to this whole idea of, Christianity being a copycat religion or plagiarizing stories from, ancient text or whatever.
It's very interesting that they go through this idea of different kinds of attacks that they come about with. The gospel is so unique that there's nothing like it. But let's go back and grant some assumption there. First philosophically, and then doctrinally. Philosophically, there's a logical problem with something like that. Just because two things have one thing in common doesn't mean they have everything in common. I have ears, elephants have ears, therefore I'm an elephant. It's a constant flaw logically. The Bible talks about a Redeemer figure, and the Dead Sea community talked about a Redeemer figure. What's the difference? So it's the same old thing. You go to Qumran and the Essenes, or you come to the Gospel writers, they both talk about a Redeemer figure and so on. You go back to the book of Esther, you've got the book of Ruth, you've got a Redeemer figure there. You go back to some ancient Near Eastern sources, you've got a Redeemer coming and rescuing. The differences are so drastic in these things that we have to take pause and point out two things. Number one, the Bible said, God who in diverse manners and at sundry times has spoken to us through the prophets, in the last days has spoken to us through the sons. There are diverse manners in which God has spoken, because oral tradition will carry stories. For example, you've got the Latin deity Jupiter. You've got the Greek deity Zeus Pater. You've got the Babylonian deity Dyaus Pitar. These are transliterations of the same word. And when you come into the Babylonian scheme of it, Dyaus and Pitar are very close to the very Hindi language. Daya means mercy. Pitar, from Pita, for father. Why would it be impossible to not have some ideational transfer between cultures when people are traveling, people are carrying messages? Of course there will be. But what is the distinctive? Whether you go back to the Code of Hammurabi, or you go back to various laws that are given to us in ancient times, or you go even to the Greeks who come out with all these ideas of knowledge and so forth, the Hebrews gave us something very unique, and that's where the Hebrew culture and the Egyptian culture came into tension. It was in the Egyptian culture, the monarch was the divine being. Whether you've got the Pharaoh or whether you've got Tutankhamun, you've got all these figures of old that are embalmed and entombed. They were to be the deities. But you come to the Greek culture, you come to the Hebrew culture, and you come to the Judeo-Christian tradition, moral laws are always secondary to your primary need, which is that of salvation. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, therefore you shall have no other gods before me. All these moral frameworks that were given were a means of attaining horizontal or maybe even vertical peace of some sort. This is very contrary to the biblical story. The biblical story says none of these things are really going to transform you or save you. You need first to have the inner being, your inner heart transformed by grace. It is a gift of God. And so when Saul of Tarsus is changed to Paul the Apostle and writes by the encounter with Jesus, he writes in Philippians 2, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon himself the form of a servant. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also has exalted him, and given to him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That was the earliest gospel. That was the hymn in which they sang to each other. There is no Egyptian, there is no Babylonian, there is no Akkadian, there's no Near Eastern source that ever puts that story together the way it is. And you go back to the Qumran community in the Teacher of Righteousness. There is no resurrection in that part of the story. There is just, once again, a teacher of righteousness who's instructing you in law as to how you may attain the right way and the right path. What did Buddha tell you? Gautama Buddha, who predates a lot of these guys. You know, you're talking about Gautama Buddha over 500 BC. Moral law, four noble truths, four parts, 8 noble truths, and so on. You go back to the time of Abraham, 3000 BC. So you're not just talking about Egyptian culture now, you're talking about this man from Ur of the Chaldees. And what is he looking for? By faith, looking for the answer, whose builder, and the city whose builder and maker was God. He was the man of the tent and the man of the altar, the transitoriness of life and the sanctity of life. If you go to Egypt today, people will tell you things like this. I was in Egypt a couple months ago. And a member in the cabinet of the president says to me in a conversation, he says, you know what? He says, all the nations around us are in a mess right now because of the politicization of religion. All of them are like that. Even as I'm driving in today to talk to you, Saudi Arabia and Iran beginning to draw swords, and the UAE joining together and saying between the Sunni and the Shia. So that's about 600 AD, okay? That all these problems began as a succession to Muhammad. The man in Egypt is telling me, why have we been spared? He said, I don't know. But you know, this is where Moses led the people out of slavery into freedom. This is where Joseph was the prime minister and taught the Pharaoh how to preserve, how to protect the people. This is where Jesus came to be protected from the sword of Herod. So he's talking about Moses, he's talking about Joseph, he's talking about Jesus. What are you going back to? About 1500 before Christ. You know, it's millennia before Christ. So people who say these stories are all plagiarized ought to read a little bit of C.S. Lewis, who was an expert in mythology. And he says, when I read mythology, I know it's mythology. So you talk about Osiris and all. Right. He said, when I'm reading history, I know I'm reading history. So you take 1,500 years before Jesus, the prophetic schema. You take the book of Daniel, from Daniel 8 to 11, the specific prophecies of the kingdoms that were going to come, ultimately to Greece, and the division of Greece into 4, the blending into 2, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid, and the emergence into the Roman Empire. This is not mythology. This is specific pre-written prophecy in history.
Let's go.
So exact, you see. So these are the stories that I think the Bible is a book of history.
Yes, sir.
It's just a very reckless and, pardon my using the word, a sophomoric dismissal of the historic facts of the Christian faith.